I've had a couple of titles for this. Future Farming was one, and there was another one on the importance of the agri-food sector to the UK. I'm actually going to talk most about farming, but the agri-food sector is obviously an immensely important part of the UK economy. I think about 14% or something like that, but certainly the biggest individual sector, but very, very diverse, which is a big challenge. Now, I'm Chief Scientific Advisor at DEFRA, and I notice all the cameras around the room. Now, as Chief Scientific Advisor, I have a certain amount of freedom about what I can say, so nothing of what I'm going to say is UK government policy. And it's important to emphasise that, because actually there is a huge amount of in flux at the moment, and there's a huge amount of discussion going on in government, outside government, about what's going to happen in agriculture in the UK. And I'm just part of that discussion, but I'm part of it within that internal government process. And what I want to do is just give you a feel for some of the things that kind of are on the table. Clearly, we cannot say what is going to happen over the next few years. And actually, I would say it's going to be over the next decade, because I think the process that we're going through at the moment is a process of change, and there's going to be very significant change, but it's not going to be sudden change, because sudden change usually is not good change. It will be structured, and it will be driven by strategy and that sort of thing. So, the conversations that need to happen are conversations which involve all the stakeholders about what that change should actually look like. Most of you here probably know much more than me about the kind of challenges that exist as a result of EU exit, the trade challenges that are going to happen. But nevertheless, I think that we need to ground some of those in some of the challenges that we have internally within our own agricultural sector. And of course, at the end of this, training is going to come out as being really important. I was at a BBSRC council meeting last week. This AgriFood training partnership is seen as a flagship success for BBSRC, and I think it should be seen that way. Absolutely, from a DEFRA perspective, it's just fantastic that it's BBSRC money that's going into it, and I would strongly encourage BBSRC to keep going. But I think, being very serious, we do have some very significant challenges within the agricultural sector, and I would start with the first one is the productivity challenge. And we in the UK have a very advanced agricultural sector, but actually, if you compare ourselves, benchmark ourselves against our major competitors in the developed countries, we're flatlining compared with them. They are increasing in their productivity, and we are not. And frankly, we don't understand why, although I'm going to come back to some reasons that I think are behind this, and training does come into it. So we have a significant productivity problem, and if you project that into a future where we may have very different trading relationships with very different countries and very different competition in the marketplace, and I could point to livestock and potential competition with Australia and New Zealand, we could see extreme changes quite quickly, although we want to obviously try to manage those changes. But there's a challenge there about innovation within certainly the livestock sector in that case, about how they can develop themselves into a more high-value niche market and market themselves in very different sorts of ways. So there's that productivity challenge. There's also, I think, a challenge around the way that the agricultural industry is structured. Now, I know that we talk about it as one industry, and I know that it's not one industry. There are all sorts of different sectors, and they work very independently. But one of the advantages or disadvantages that I have sitting within a government department at a strategic level within a government department is that you take a very helicopter view of the world. And I mean, if I can sum it up with a statistic, about 80% of the production in this country is produced by 20% of farmers on 50% of the land. Now that's an interesting statistic, because that means that 80% of the farmers are producing 20% of the production. And you know, we can do all sorts of things in terms of trying to get new technology into the farming industry. But if the farming industry is not actually geared up in whatever way to take up that technology, we can invent the technology. BBSRC can do a fantastic job about getting universities and researchers developing new technologies. But if there isn't a receptor at the other end, if I can use a biological term, then it's actually for naught. And one of, I think, our problems is that we have a large chunk of the farming industry that is basically, probably, I'll be frank, not doing a very good job. Okay? Now that's quite controversial. But let's try and break that 80% down a little bit and see what they might look like. And and this is my theory. You may disagree with it, but you know, we're going to have a bunch of farmers in that 80% who are genuinely aspirational, who really want to become a part of the 20%, but they're not there, and there's something holding them back. It may be capital that's holding them back, or it may be that they just can't get hold of the information that they need and the business structures that they need in order to be able to transform themselves. So there's that group. There's what I think is probably quite a large group of what I would call lifestyle farmers, and I don't say that in any pejorative sort of way. It's just that they choose to farm that way, and they're quite happy farming that way. They do it pretty much in the way that their fathers did, and their grandfathers beforehand. They've maybe inherited farms, that sort of thing. There's a lifestyle group there of farmers, and of course I'm grossly generalising here. So I'm probably being very unfair to some people, but I think that's the risk you take of being strategic about these sorts of things. And then there's a group of people who call themselves farmers but are not farmers. And this is a really interesting one, because it's a question I ask in DEFRA a lot about the data around this, because we don't have any data on this. This is about the serviceisation of agriculture. I happen to live in Scotland, actually, and the land that is around where I live is farmed, but it's not farmed by the farmer. It's actually, some of it's rented out, some of it's on some sort of lease deal, some of it's on another kind of deal where it's a partnership deal with shared risk and all that sort of stuff. And virtually none of the machinery that runs on the land that's around where I live is owned by the farmer. It's all bought in by services. And the farmer herself is never seen on the land at all. Now, and she lives in the Isle of Man. Now, you know, there's a lot more of that going on than we ever imagine. And it's good. It's a good thing, because it's about driving the productivity of the industry. It's about specialisation. It's about services within the industry. But we, in central government, have virtually no idea about the size of that kind of process. So there's a bunch of farmers who call themselves farmers but aren't farmers. And then there's a bunch of farmers who are just useless. You know, they're just, and they're, you know, it happens in every walk of life. There are people who just don't do the job very well, you know, but a key issue about developing policy in this area is to understand the segregation and structure of the industry that you're dealing with, and in order, if you have money to spend, if you have public money to spend, you want to spend it in the way that is most effective, that is going to drive towards your objectives. So what are the objectives? Well, the objectives could be productivity, okay? Now, I'm not saying that that should be the objective, but it could be productivity. If it's productivity, then what you would do is take public money and you would use it to help that proportion of the 80% that want to become the 20%. So you'll see where I'm going here. A future agricultural support system has got to be much more fine-tuned to understanding where value can be driven from the public funding that is being used. You could also use public funding to pay for outcomes, and particularly environmental outcomes. And there are all sorts of structures around that as well. And I know that that's certainly something that's in the mix. But whatever happens, I think the future, the revision that we might have of the Common Agricultural Policy is going to move in those sorts of directions. So I was asked to talk about the future of farming. That is a kind of vision for the future. We're not going to be able to afford to have the agricultural support systems, in my view, that we've had in the past. And it will probably be for the better, because we'll be spending money better, we'll be spending in a much more targeted way, and will probably drive up productivity. Now, just on that productivity issue, yes, from a BBSRC perspective, we want to get all the great new technologies into farming, but the reality is that the 20% that are productive are probably already really good at doing that. So the question is, how do we get the technologies into the others who are interested in doing it, even the lifestyle people, because they can be made more productive as well. Again, an understanding of how we bring those technologies forward is really important. So just turning to skills for a minute. Another statistic, only about 30% of our farmers run a cash flow and a business plan. Now, I pause there because actually that is just amazing. I've run businesses. You cannot run a business without a cash flow and a business plan. It just is not possible to do it. Is it any wonder, therefore, that more than 50% or about 50% of our lowland livestock farmers are unprofitable even after they get their subsidy? So, when we're talking about training, we're not really talking about understanding the complexities of photosynthesis and molecular genetics and things like that. We're talking about just understanding how to run a business. And the difference here is between two strategies. One strategy is, how do you make the very best farmers a bit better? And of course that's something we should be doing. Or how do you make your average farmer, who probably sits in that 80% that's just producing 20% of the production, just 5% better, 10% better. If you make your average farmer 5 or 10% better, you've solved your productivity problem overnight. And it's not too difficult. Well, technically it's not too difficult, because it's actually about getting some simple ideas over to a very large number of people. Now, whether there's a willingness to take on those ideas is another matter. So this brings me to my final point, and it's about extension services. I hear lots of people saying, DEFRA should never have privatised its extension services, etc. I'm sure Bob is in that camp. I don't know if you are, but I know that many agricultural researchers say that actually that was a bad thing to do. I'm not going to make a judgment about that, but we are where we are with it, because what the extension services did was to essentially provide the capability of somebody with knowledge walking into a farm and actually teaching farmers about what could be done, and off they go and trial it. And there was a feedback process about what worked and all that sort of stuff, and the knowledge was passed on. We actually have a very vibrant extension services industry in this country, and in Europe generally. We've got lots and lots of extension services. So, the privatisation has kind of worked because actually there's lots of services around. However, because it's private, it will only service those organisations and companies and people and farmers who actually can afford to pay for them. So they're probably working with the 20% rather than the 80%. I see somebody. Okay. So I would love to get feedback on that.
I'm going to give you, because I've been through the whole ADAS privatisation.
Okay, that's fine. You know a lot more about it than I do. But so I'm coming back to farmer support again. How would you then want to support farmers? Well, again, it's not the 20%. It's the people who need the help within the system. So if we're going to use the privatised extension services, it's about subsidising them to be able to walk in the farm gate of the farmers who normally wouldn't lift the telephone and ask them to come in and help them. I hope that in what I've said, I've stimulated some thinking at the very least, and some controversy, because actually what I really want to do through this is to stimulate discussion, because we have 2 to 3 years before we need to think very seriously about what our future farm support system is going to look like. And what I want to be sure of is that training and education targeted at the right people is really top of the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. I suspect we might have a question. You might like to elaborate on your previous question. Is that mic behind you?
Oh, right. I've been through the privatisation. I was in ADAS when it was part of MAF, and I've now in ADAS still. There are a couple of key issues. Yes, there are a lot of extension services available. There's some fantastic consultants out there, but there's some not very good ones as well. A lot of those top 20% do deal with extension services, the best of them, and that's how they're staying in the top 20%, and they're seeking further education, all the rest of it. I'm going to be very controversial now, and I'm not political at all, but a lot of the people that are staying in the industry are staying in because they've had direct support from the government to stay in the farming industry, and they're reliant on that direct support. And I also work in Wales, where we've had government subsidised direct support through Farming Connect for a number of years. And I know Andrew's now left, but that's a discussion you probably have to have with Andrew Slade as to whether the impact of government subsidised support is there. The best way to make a major change in the industry is to remove all the direct support. But then you've got all the implications of that, which I don't need to go into.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And something I didn't say in my talk is that all the ideas of productivity are tensioned against the rural economy and the structure of rural communities as well. And of course, politically, that's important. So, finding the balance in that tension is going to be quite difficult. Frankly, there are lots and lots of ways of getting it wrong, and relatively few ways of getting it right.
I want to make a comment, because obviously Ian took my name in vain at one point. And I found it interesting that Ian is living in Scotland and working in England. I've done the opposite. I actually have lived in England and worked in Scotland and been involved with SAC and SIUC, who obviously run the Scottish Extension Service. And I don't think it's actually an either-or situation, actually, because I've seen the benefits of both in that context, and certainly in Scotland, where they do get some benefits about having a centrally funded advisory service. And the question is, how do you best utilise that? But I think the other aspect, as from a UK perspective, is we also need to look overseas. We look at the land grant type of system in the US, the way Chegas works, and then in the alternative is you look at New Zealand, where they withdrew a lot of support immediately. That causes major issues, social issues. So I think it's not an either or. It's about what is best for us, and how, if we were to have more central support for extension, how does that drive the type of changes that Ian was talking about? And I think that's the key aspect of this, I think.
I mean, and also just to work off what you've said, Bob. Whenever I speak to farmers about this, actually they're really keen to see change as well. I mean, I'm talking very generally about the industry, but one of the things that I think that before we got into this, that there was a slight fear of is that there would be a lot of pushback from the farming industry. It's nothing like that at all. They're really up for this. It's just that it has to happen at a pace that allows them to adjust their business models, etc., to make it happen.
Hello, Ian. Jim Godfrey, probably the only farmer in the audience here. I don't particularly disagree with what the comment said, but I think I will just give it a little bit of pushback. Certainly from our perspective as farmers, what we would like to see from government is actually really a change of culture within government and with the government agencies, from that of policeman and watchdog on us to actually one of helping us and supporting us to actually achieve this better productivity, better ecosystem services, whatever.
Yeah, I don't think you would find anybody in DEFRA who would disagree with that at all. I think there has been a culture, and it's a culture, and it goes way back, probably to the Second World War, where agriculture was such a strategically important issue for the country, where government actually just had to drive the process, and it's taking a long time to get that out of the system, and of course the subsidy system doesn't really help very much with that at all. So I mean, ministers would be 100% behind you, and pretty much everybody in DEFRA would be 100% behind you on that. It's just that how do we march along that track? Absolutely.
Thanks. Another question down front?
Hello, David May, and this is speaking in a personal capacity, just so I'm clear, just in case I get quoted again somewhere. How is the government going to join up with the IDR, which the Chief Scientist is running, which also is talking about extension and how we digitise and how we extend that? So one of the ideas that came out of the session that was had a few weeks ago was about having centres where we can show farmers, food industry, what's going on, because it feels like actually there's a real opportunity. And having been in ADAS during the early days of charging, pre-privatisation, actually the fact that you could bring people and show them what to do was one of the best ways of communicating. And I think it's that we've lost, and that was one of the things which came strongly out of the discussions we had recently.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have the agri-tech centres have been set up, the 4 agri-tech centres, and their function is partly to do that. It's certainly to take technologies that are at the kind of TRL4 level and sort of move them on, and in moving them on, engaging with industry about how they're going to be applied and that sort of thing. So I think there's something going on in that area. Is it enough? No. I mean, we'd like it to be a lot more. And of course, they've only been in existence for about a year, so they're only just beginning to get going. Are they functioning yet? No, they're not. They're going to need 5 to 10 years to really move onwards. But I think that a view like that coming from the stakeholder community, from the industry, is really important, because if the industry is prepared to engage, and actually, to be frank, to put some money into it, government will almost certainly partner with that. And the industrial challenge, the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund is all about innovation, really. It's, well, not all, but most of it's about innovation and trying to drive that pipeline through. But I'll go back to what I said earlier on. There's no point in really trying to drive that pipeline of innovation unless there are enough people at the far end of it who are really waiting for the products. And I think that's the problem that we have in agriculture. Some of it might be solved as a result of reform of the subsidy system, because if we reform the subsidy system, then land prices will probably go down. more people will get access to it, younger people will come into the industry. There could be a revolutionary change over a number of years as a result of something like that. And as soon as you get younger, sort of educated people in, there will be that pool. But at the moment, I don't see that pool in sufficient volume to really make a big difference.
Okay, just one question here and then last one over here.
Jo Price from the Royal Agricultural University. I mean, it was a comment, really. We've heard a lot about driving innovation in sort of productivity and technology, but one of the key areas which jumps to my mind is the whole area of understanding that social science piece. It's that interdisciplinary research piece, isn't it? Which is going to enable those who are still out there in this window before the young people come through to try and understand. It's about extension, isn't it, and understanding how to get to those communities, isn't it? And I think it's that encouraging these partnerships to sort of build on that social science connection as well in terms of research funding as well, isn't it?
Yes, I mean it's social science rather than trying to just analyse the system. It's social science with a purpose to try and, if possible, drive behaviour change. And it's not unwilling behaviour change. It's just making. It's the way I put it is you try to put paths down where people want to walk. So it's knowing where to put the paths is the important thing. Yeah.
It's the last question here.
Shamal Mohammed from Agri. I'm working for Agri, which we have more than 300 agronomists, and we provide services to more than 20,000 customers in the UK. And my question is, in terms of driving and improving the productivity you mentioned, and also helping the 80% of the farmers you mentioned, what kind of working relationship you see between the companies like ourselves and the government to drive this agenda forward? Because I believe until now that relationship wasn't quite good enough, and also in terms of the support from the training and skills, which mainly targeting the SMEs rather than the large companies. Do you think there is a potential working relationship going forward?
Obviously, yes. I mean, I wouldn't say anything other than that. The question is how to structure that relationship that incentivises both you as a company and the farmers that we would like to target to actually get together. I could speculate on what that might look like, but government has relatively few strings it can pull. It can change regulation. Or it can incentivise, or it can use fiscal measures. I think in this case we're in an incentivisation space, using public money to change behaviours and to again move the industry onwards and to help companies like yours address what I would call the market failure in certain parts of the industry. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Ian.
Pleasure.